Hello, this is Mike Powell, President of the Brunswick Civil War Roundtable. I've been watching the NFL channel lately, and they've been running a series on top 10 players at each position, top 10 quarterbacks of all time, top 10 receivers, top 10 running backs. I thought, why don't we look at the top 10 events of the Civil War? And those should be a lot of thought-provoking ideas that should stimulate some conversation. I'd like for you to let me know through email or on the Facebook page what your ideas would be, what you would add to mine or take away from my list. So let's see where we can get with this. If I give you a second to bring up a PowerPoint, get started. There we go. Okay. The first one I want to look at is the wounding of Joe Johnston that allowed Robert E. Lee to take command of the Confederate forces in the Eastern Theater. On May 31st, at the Battle of Seven Pines, which was a preliminary fight to the 7 Days Battle, Confederate General Joe Johnston was riding along with an officer. They were riding through the thick of the battle, and an officer that accompanied Johnston kept flinching each time a shot came near. Johnston chided the young man and said, "There is no use dodging. When you hear them, they've passed." Just a moment later, Johnston was hit in the right shoulder by a bullet, and then a shell burst in front of him and a fragment hit him in the chest. He fell from his horse seriously wounded and unconscious. He regained consciousness as he was being carried to a hospital, and his main concern seemed to be the whereabouts of his sword, which had sentimental value to him. Major General Gustavus Smith replaced Johnston in command and finished the battle that day. But on June 2nd, 1862, Jefferson Davis removed Smith from command and replaced him with Robert E. Lee, who up to that time had only gained the nickname Granny Lee for his failed campaign in West Virginia. He had been acting as a military advisor for Jefferson Davis when he was given command. When George McClellan, the Union commander at Seven Pines, heard the news that Lee was in command, it was said to be music to his ears. His impression of Lee would soon change, and as would the history of the war. The second event I want to look at is the Militia Act of July 17, 1862. The Militia Act of 1792 called for the militia forces of the states to be made up of free, able-bodied, white male citizens. When the war began, that law was still in effect. The war in 1861 and early 62 was being fought for the preservation of the Union. It was to be a white man's war. In September of 1861, though, Gideon Welles, in order to meet the needs of the expanding U.S. Navy, called for the enlistment of escaped slaves into the Navy. Contrabands. It would take the Army 9 more months until July 17, 1862, to pass the new Militia Act that allowed blacks to enlist in the Army. It had an immediate effect on the war. Armed blacks were the South's worst nightmare. It provided the North, already with a superiority of men, to increase that advantage almost without end. And it gave the African Americans the right to claim their freedom, having served in the noble cause with their white soldier compatriots. How could Lincoln deny them freedom after they had served in the war? The war now, besides being fought to preserve the Union, took on the end of slavery as a goal, and the Emancipation Proclamation was not far behind. The third one I looked at is the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued on January 1st, 1863. As president, Lincoln gained much knowledge and experience about the true nature of slavery in the South. His mind was moving towards emancipating the slaves. But how to do it without several neutral states joining the Confederacy and causing great political upheaval in some Union states that were not abolitionist in nature. But as the war went on, he did change his mind and decided that victory for the Union must include the end of slavery. His Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, was more of a military document than a means to set the slaves free. It only freed those slaves still in territory controlled by the Confederacy. The argument is often made that it actually freed no slaves at all, since it was doubtful that any Southern slave owner would comply with Lincoln's new edict. The main effect of this document was felt in England and France. Both countries had already done away with slavery, and it would not do in the halls of Parliament for England to recognize the existence of a Confederate nation based on slavery. Hopes for European intervention in the war on the side of the South were gone. The hopes that England would help to break the Union blockade of the South with their huge navy to get at Southern cotton also disappeared. The fourth point that I want to look at is the Battle of Gettysburg. Flushed with a string of victories, Lee took his Army of Northern Virginia into Union heartland of Pennsylvania. He and his officers must have felt a sense of invincibility as they marched through Yankee land. His first raid in 1862 went into Maryland, but it seemed more of just being a raid than a movement of some great strategic plan to conquer. And even today, there are several theories as to what Lee actually hoped to accomplish in this second movement north. Was it to gather food, since Northern Virginia had been the seat of the war and was picked clean of provisions? Or did he really think he would make it all the way to Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania capital? Then what? He couldn't stay there, so far from his lines of communication. Did he ever really think he could approach Washington, D.C. from the rear? The battle that took place at Gettysburg was the largest the continent had ever seen. For 3 days, they pounded one another, and for the first time, Lee suffered an undeniable defeat. He was lucky to get his men back across the Potomac. It would be the last time that Lee's army took the strategic offensive. And in 1964, he sent Jubal Early into the Shenandoah Valley to threaten Washington from that area, but they were more of a nuisance. And even though they spent a couple of days on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. at Fort Stevens, the capital was never really in danger. From Gettysburg on, Lee would fight on the defensive and never leave his home state until the end of the war. The fifth point, Vicksburg, the capture of Vicksburg, July 1863. Lincoln was not a military man before the war, but he was a quick learner. He knew that Vicksburg and its railroad across the Mississippi River was the key to that area. Memphis above and New Orleans below had already been captured, but as long as Vicksburg remained in Confederate hands, it was a lifeline to the supplies and food for the Confederates from the Trans-Mississippi Theater. With Vicksburg captured and the last railroad across the Great River closed to Confederate traffic, Texas cattle stayed in Texas, Arkansas wheat stayed in Arkansas. They would be limited to only those supplies they could smuggle through the blockade. And with each year, the blockade grew stronger and tighter. Vicksburg was the military masterpiece of U.S. Grant. Lincoln liked Grant for many reasons, but particularly because he fought. The logistical and natural difficulties of taking Vicksburg were immense, but Grant was relentless, if anything. And in the spring of 1863, his movements placed him on the same side of the Mississippi River as Vicksburg and on dry ground. When he accomplished that, Vicksburg was doomed. The Confederates tried to stop him, but he pushed them out of the way to the prize and soon laid siege to the city. John Pemberton, the Confederate commander, capitulated on July 4th, believing that day he would get the best of terms. Coupled with the victory of Gettysburg, Lincoln had a couple of really good days in the first week of July 1863, and Vicksburg began the process of the ever-shrinking Confederacy. Number 6, Grant is given command. Lincoln finds a general, finally. March 10th, 1864. Lincoln had found his general, and he brought the Westerner to the east to command the armies of the North. Grant met with Sherman at a Cincinnati hotel while Grant was traveling east, and together they planned a strategy that had all of the Union armies throughout the country acting towards the same objective. It was the first time in the war for this. Sherman would take Atlanta. Phil Sheridan would clear the Shenandoah Valley of Confederates, while Ben Butler would operate at Bermuda Hundred and threaten Richmond. And while all this was going on, Grant would handle Lee in the Overland Campaign in Virginia. The ultimate objective that they all acted towards was the capture of Richmond, but more importantly, the defeat of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And Grant was just the man to get that done. The next point, May 6, 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness. Union commanders before Grant had a couple of things in common. They usually got beat by Lee, and when defeated, they would return to the safety of Washington's forts, regroup, and plan another on to Richmond campaign. On May 5th, Grant began his relentless pursuit of Lee's army in old territory in the wilderness, west of Fredericksburg. It was a vicious two-day bludgeoning on both sides, but Lee would not break and had the better of the fighting. Most other Union commanders would have retreated north to lick their many wounds, not Grant. As his army approached the Brock Road, the men all wondered, would they march to the left and go north or to the south in pursuit of Lee? Unit after unit cheered as they turned south towards Spotsylvania Courthouse in an attempt to outflank the wily Confederate general, who by now knew he was up against a different type of Union commander. Within a month, Lee would be bottled up in Petersburg, forced to withstand months of siege. Excuse me. The next event, September 2nd, 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta. In November 1863, Grant had captured Chattanooga, a major railroad hub. Sherman's part of the 1864 strategy was to leave Chattanooga and capture Atlanta. Atlanta was one of the South's premier cities. It had railroads that covered the lower South, and it was a major manufacturing hub. Sherman once said that every wagon he came upon was stamped "Made in Atlanta." The unfortunate Joe Johnston was brought west to replace the hapless Braxton Bragg after losing Chattanooga. The army that he inherited was hardly a band of brothers, disputing factions in the Confederate high command, ambitious men who thought they should have had the command were only part of Joe Johnston's dilemma. He also knew the mettle of his opponent and knew that William T. Sherman was heading his way with a juggernaut of an army. The campaign was one of Sherman trying to outflank Johnston's army and the Confederates doing their best not to be trapped. The fighting was nothing compared to the slaughter taking place between Lee and Grant, and Jeff Davis and others in Richmond wondered why Johnston wasn't fighting for Atlanta with everything he had. Joe Johnston's constant retreats back towards Atlanta led some to muse that he would eventually fight the Battle of Key West. The constant falling back was too much for Davis to bear, and he replaced Johnston with the rash John Bell Hood, who Lee once commented, "Too much lion, not enough fox." missing an arm and a leg. He lost his arm and leg. He had to be tied to his horse. The amount of pain medication that he was taking is still an argument today. But Hood was the fighter that Jefferson Davis was looking for. But his tactics lacked any imagination. And Sherman was happy to let Hood batter his entrenched veteran army. By September 2nd, 1864, Sherman had captured the roads and rails into Atlanta and entered the city as its conqueror. The election of 1864 was only a couple months away. Lincoln himself wrote a letter in June expressing the belief that he may lose the election. The people were war-weary and saw no light at the end of the tunnel. Atlanta became that light. Number 9 turning point or decisive point in the war is the election of 1864 between Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan. Atlanta, and to some degree Phil Sheridan's victory in the Shenandoah Valley at Cedar Creek, brought forth good headlines that Lincoln needed in the newspapers if he was going to win the election. Atlanta, Cedar Creek, when Lee besieged in Petersburg, unable to threaten anybody, the Northern voters were willing to stay with Lincoln and see it through. Had Lincoln lost, it was felt that McClellan would make peace, allowing the South to either become a sovereign country of their own or return to the Union with slavery intact. Lincoln's re-election ended both of those Southern dreams. The last event that I look at, number 10, is the assassination of Lincoln on April 14th, 1865. And although not actually part of the war itself, it is certainly the main contributor to the Reconstruction period that happened after. John Wilkes Booth believed that by killing Lincoln, it would reignite a fire in the land and the South could still prevail. It is ironic that by killing Lincoln, he probably doomed them to the unfortunate period known as Reconstruction. Lincoln's entire policy towards the South was one of malice toward none, and as he told Grant before Appomattox, left them up easy. President Johnston was not cut of the same cloth. It is one of those what ifs if Lincoln had lived to see it through. So those are my 10 important events of the Civil War. My disclaimer, so that no one throws rocks at me if they see me on the streets, is that these are simply my decisive turning points. And I think you could even distinguish between turning points and decisive events. My criteria was that the events had significance beyond what happened that day. I understand that there are many other events: the killing of Stonewall Jackson, the Battle of Hampton Roads, Lee's decision not to disband his army and fight a war in the hills at Appomattox, and I'm sure you can think of others. I hope this stimulates some thought and discussion, and I'd like to hear your ideas and why you would either add or detract from my list. Have a great day and stay safe.